Okay, Gen Bio folks, welcome back to the second part of this unit. And we are covering Chapter 9 now. Remember, we covered Chapter 10 first. And remember, in Chapter 10, we studied the way that autotrophs have the ability to take sunlight and to make glucose, to take sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and to make sugar. So in this chapter, what we're going to focus on is how organisms use that sugar. How do they actually break that down into energy? And remember, this is undertaken by the plants that made it. They burn some of that energy for themselves, but also the heterotrophs use that energy as well. So that's what we're going to focus on in this chapter. And you can get a look at this overview graphic. Actually, this graphic isn't in your books, but there's a similar graphic on page 165 of your books. And if you take a look at it, and I hope I've driven this point home by the graphic that I used for your module picture, as well as this picture, is that photosynthesis and respiration are a cyclical process. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And so this picture is on page 165 of your books. And again, it shows that cyclical process of photosynthesis and respiration. And I like to say that once you study this process or these two processes, you'll figure out that Mother Nature is the ultimate recycler. So what we're focusing on in this chapter are energy releasing pathways. How we take sugar or food or anything that we consume and how our bodies actually convert that to energy at the cellular level. For many endurance athletes, this is the limiting factor in their performance. It's the rate at which food or energy in the presence of oxygen is converted to work. So your aerobic capacity is the maximum rate at which oxygen can be taken in and used by your muscle cells. Therefore, the most strenuous exercise that your body can maintain aerobically. So we talked a little bit about this in Chapter 10, but this is covered much better in Chapter 9, and it is applicable to both chapters, so I want you to read over it and make sure you have a good understanding of it. And this topic is talked about on page 165 and 166 of your books. Now, if you've had chemistry, you may have had this already, but it's always good to review it. And these are called reduction-oxidation reactions, also known for short as redox reactions. So when a substance is oxidized, it loses electrons. Okay, let me say that again. When a substance is oxidized, it loses electrons. When a substance is reduced, it gains electrons. Think of its charge being reduced because it's gaining an electron. And so in this picture, we're talking about sodium and chloride. And remember, we said sodium tends to give up an electron to chlorine, and they both become ions. So in this case, sodium would become oxidized because it lost an electron, and chlorine becomes reduced because it gained an electron. Therefore, they become ions. Sodium is the positive ion because it lost an electron, and chlorine is a negative ion because it gained an electron. So this same thing happens in photosynthesis. Okay, the carbon dioxide becomes reduced and the water becomes oxidized. And we're going to have the same thing happen in respiration, and this is pictured on page 166 of your books. Okay, so we're going to have the glucose becomes oxidized and the oxygen becomes reduced. So just to give you an idea of how much your body goes through glucose, just the cells of your brain burn through about 1/4 pound of glucose each day. So what we're focusing on in this chapter are energy releasing pathways. These are going to be catabolic. We are breaking them down. And the main one that we'll be talking about is aerobic respiration. We'll be talking about others, but the majority of the chapter is on aerobic respiration. And here's the balanced equation for that. And there's a slightly different version of that on page 166 of your books. So what I want you to take a look at is I want you to write this down on a piece of paper, and I want you to write also the photosynthesis equation on a piece of paper. And take a look at them and compare them. If you take a look, these are almost the exact same equations, just flipped around. So if you take a look at photosynthesis, we start out with 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water plus sunlight. Okay, we'll see 2 out of 3 of those on the right-hand side of the respiration equation. And if you take a look at the right-hand side of photosynthesis, we end up with photosynthesis, or products of photosynthesis are 1 molecule of glucose, C6H12O6, plus 6 molecules of oxygen. And if you take a look at respiration, those 2 items are on the left-hand side of the reaction in respiration. So again, noting the cyclical process of these 2 processes. So aerobic respiration is ATP formation that requires oxygen, hence the name aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration results in 32 ATP molecules. Now you'll notice that there's a slightly different number in your Labster simulation this week. I'm going to stick with these numbers and stick with your book. Aerobic respiration is the most efficient form of respiration. For each molecule of glucose, you're going to get 32 ATP. We will look at other methods of respiration later in the chapter, but none of them get as many ATP for each molecule of glucose. They get way less ATP per molecule of glucose. Again, aerobic respiration gets 32 ATP for each molecule of glucose. So let's talk a little bit about fermentation or anaerobic respiration. And again, we'll talk more about this later in the chapter, but just for comparison purposes, anaerobic respiration or fermentation does not require the presence of oxygen, but you only get 2 ATP molecules for each molecule of glucose. So way less efficient than aerobic, which gives you 32 ATP per molecule of glucose. There is a third type of reaction called an anaerobic electron transport. And this is not used by us. This is only used by certain bacteria. And as the name implies, it does not require oxygen. And also the ATP yield is usually small. It is about 2 ATP. So again, we have three processes: aerobic respiration, which gives you 32 ATP, fermentation, which gives you 2 ATP, and anaerobic electron transport, which also gives you about 2 ATP. So here's just a graphic representation of cellular respiration. Again, you are going to need to know the balanced equations for both photosynthesis and respiration. Okay, so in this overview, you start out with 1 molecule of glucose, 6 molecules of oxygen, and you're going to end up, after a series of reactions, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and about 32 ATP. And so here are the 3 steps of aerobic respiration. And this is pictured on page 168 of your books. And what we're going to do is we are going to go through these 3 steps of aerobic respiration. Here's another way of looking at it, and this is pictured on page 169 of your books. So we're going to start with glycolysis. We're going to then go through pyruvate oxidation, and then the citric acid cycle, and then oxidative phosphorylation. It's almost 4 steps. The pyruvate oxidation I kind of refer to as a prep step. And here's just another way of looking at it where they have taken that prep step out. But these are the 3 main reactions of respiration. So glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and then electron transport chain. Notice on this graphic, it also shows you where they take place. Okay, that's going to become important as well. Glycolysis takes part in the cytoplasm, and both the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain happen in the mitochondria. So regardless of whether we're doing aerobic or anaerobic respiration, all 3 of the processes that we discussed start in the cytoplasm with glycolysis. The aerobic respiration reactions end in the mitochondria, and the other reactions, the anaerobic ones, are completed in the cytoplasm of the cell. So since all 3 processes start with glycolysis, we're going to start with that process. And remember, glycolysis yields 2 ATP. It occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. And what happens is that glucose molecule, which contains 6 carbons, is converted into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. And those pyruvic acid molecules have 3 carbons each. So essentially, glucose is cut in half. During this process, 2 NADH are produced. Remember in the last chapter we were talking about NADPH. This molecule does the same job as NADPH. It's just a different molecule in a different place. And you've got a good description of exactly what happens with NADH on page 167 of your books. So I encourage you to read that. Now at the top of this slide, I kind of lied to you because I said glycolysis yields 2 ATP. In actuality, glycolysis produces 4 ATP. However, 2 of those ATP are used up at the beginning of the reaction, so the net result of glycolysis is 2 ATP. Glycolysis is the most widespread form of respiration. Remember, we said it's used both aerobically and anaerobically. And for some single-celled organisms, this is the only part of cellular respiration they do. This is it. So they only get 2 ATP out of 1 molecule of glucose. Again, glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm, so there are no organelles needed. As you recall, bacteria don't have organelles, so that's why they don't undergo aerobic respiration. They don't have mitochondria. So glycolysis in and of itself does not require oxygen. It is also known to be the oldest form of respiration. So if you think about evolution of large organisms versus small organisms, this process takes 1 molecule of glucose and yields 2 ATP. But if you only get 2 ATP, you're not going to have enough energy in a lot of cells to grow. You're not going to have the organelles. So you can see kind of the process of organisms evolving different organelles to take on different jobs, and therefore then taking that process and enhancing on that process and coming up with aerobic respiration and making that a much more efficient process so that you get 32 ATP for every molecule of glucose in aerobic respiration. So here is the graphic for glycolysis. And again, this is pictured on page 169 of your books. And here's a little bit more detail. And this is pictured on page 170 of your books. So we're giving you a little bit more detail here. So we start out with 1 molecule of glucose. And you'll see in the first phase of glycolysis, you'll see that 2 ATP are used up. But then in the energy payoff phase, 4 ATP are produced, as well as 2 NADH. And we're taking that molecule of glucose and essentially cutting it in half. And so the net result is glucose is cut into half into two 3-carbon sugars. We get 2 ATP and 2 NADH out of that process. And here's a more detailed look at that. And you can take a look at that on page 170 and 171. There's even a lot more detailed process pictured there. But the end result is you start out with a 6-carbon glucose on the left, and you get 2 pyruvic acid on the right. You end up with 2 ATP and 2 NADH. And here's a vastly simplified version of that. And so kind of here is a summary. So we start out with glucose, plus we have to invest 2 ATP. We end up with 2 pyruvic acid or 2 pyruvate, plus 4 ATP plus 2 NADH. So the net result of glycolysis is 2 ATP and 2 NADH. What do those ATP and NADH do? They carry energy from one place to another where they can be used to do work. Second review question, is glycolysis an endergonic or exergonic reaction? It's going to be exergonic because ATP is being released by breaking down glucose. Why do 2 ATP molecules need to be put into the reaction if it is exergonic? And that's to overcome the activation energy required to get the reaction started. So again, what are the starting components? glucose and 2 ATP. What are the end products? 2 pyruvate or pyruvic acid molecules, 4 ATP, and 2 NADH. So again, what's carrying energy out of the reaction of glycolysis are 2 ATP and 2 NADH. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to focus on what happens after glycolysis in aerobic respiration. Okay, so in aerobic respiration, we're going to take those 2 ATP and 2 NADHs and then convert them and the 2 pyruvic acid molecules, and then these are going to move out of the cytoplasm and into the mitochondria. Okay, so from here on, we're going to be focusing on aerobic respiration. So this is a good overview of this. You may even want to print this slide out and keep this as we go through these next set of reactions. And again, to focus on that we are focused on aerobic respiration. So as I stated earlier, the products of aerobic respiration are 32 ATP. And they talk about 3 sets of reactions, 4 sets of reactions. I'm going to count that second one as an official step. It's in your book, but they don't always count it as an official step. Some places call it as a prep step. I'm just going to put it out there. We're gonna go through it, so we'll count it. So aerobic respiration starts with glycolysis, which we just covered, and that results in a net result of 2 ATP. The pyruvic acid molecules that came out of glycolysis are going to undergo pyruvate oxidation, and they're going to produce a molecule called acetyl-CoA. That acetyl-CoA is then going to enter the citric acid cycle and go through a set of reactions. And in those set of reactions, we're going to produce 2 ATP. And then the products of the citric acid cycle are then going to enter what's called the oxidative phosphorylation set of reactions, also known as the electron transport chain. So as we go through this, the oxidative phosphorylation and electron transport chain are the same set of reactions. And they are going to produce 28 ATP. And so here's a good graphic showing the results of that with the different amounts of ATP. Unfortunately, I don't see this graphic in your book. Nope, it's not there. Okay, so we know what we did in glycolysis. Now we're going to go to that second step called either the prep step or pyruvate oxidation. And so the products are going to move into the mitochondria. In prokaryotes, this is going to happen still in the cytoplasm. But in eukaryotes, the products are going to move to the mitochondria. So we have 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. In aerobic respiration, they are going to leave the cytoplasm and go to the mitochondria, and they are going to cross the mitochondrial membranes and go into the matrix of the mitochondria. Each 3-carbon molecule of pyruvic acid is to split into a carbon dioxide and a 2-carbon acetyl group. It's that 2-carbon acetyl group that enters the citric acid cycle. Now, if hopefully you've copied down the overall reaction of respiration and you've got that over to the side, and you take a look at it, and what are the products of aerobic respiration? They are 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. This is where you get some of that carbon dioxide. And it's as a result of this process, this is why you exhale carbon dioxide. So what do we get out of pyruvate oxidation? We get two more NADH, and we get 2 molecules of carbon dioxide, because remember we split 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Each one of those results in 1 molecule of carbon dioxide. And again, so we've produced 2 out of 6 of the molecules of carbon dioxide in aerobic respiration. And that's what we exhale. So here's a graphic of that, converting that pyruvic acid to acetyl-CoA. Remember, pyruvic acid is a 3-carbon molecule. And we're going to cut one of those carbons off. And during that process, we're going to be producing NADH. And we're going to end up with that NADH plus acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon molecule. In that process, that other carbon molecule is going to be exhaled as carbon dioxide. And here's the simplified version of that. So now the products of that are going to now enter what's called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. You'll see both of those terms used. As an overview, the citric acid cycle is going to yield 2 ATP. During the Krebs cycle, we're just breaking down and recycling those carbon molecules. What's going to come out of the Krebs cycle are going to be 6 NADH, 2 FADH2s, 2 ATP, and 4 more carbon dioxides. Again, what we exhale. So we produced 2 carbon dioxides in the previous step. We've got 4 more to go. This is where we get the other 4 carbon dioxides. And this is going to happen on the matrix, inner matrix of the mitochondria. Okay, so here is the simplified version of the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle. And just to give you an idea of how it became named as the Krebs cycle, Hans Krebs was a German-British scientist, and he worked out all the steps of this cycle in the 1930s. And so that's why sometimes it's called the Krebs cycle, sometimes it's named after the molecule, the citric acid cycle. Unfortunately, this particular graphic is not in your books, but it kind of gives an overview. And I also like it because it equates, like the BioFlix animation, equates the NADH and the FADH2s to batteries. And when they're carrying electrons, they have charges in them, and you can see those little electrons on the right. So uncharged is NAD+, charged is NADH, uncharged is FAD, and charged is FADH2. Okay? So here's the big bad cycle, and this is almost a full-page graphic on page 173 of your books. Now, back in my day, they wanted you to know every step of this and what happened at every step. We're not going to focus on that. What I want you to focus on is what goes into the equation and what goes out of the equation. Okay, so for at each acetyl-CoA, which remember we have 2 that enter the cycle, we get 3 NADH, 1 FADH2, an ATP, and 2 carbon dioxides. But remember that we have 2 molecules to go through this each time. Now, Acetyl-CoA is what enters the cycle, but there's a molecule called oxaloacetic acid, which gets recycled over and over in this cycle. And so that's how you kind of get the citric acid cycle. Okay? So how many times must the citric acid cycle be used to use all the products of the intermediate step? 2. Okay, remember we have 2 acetyl-CoAs that go into the equation. So let's go through this step. We started out with glycolysis. We did that intermediate step, and then we entered the citric acid or the Krebs cycle. The starting components of the citric acid cycle are 2 acetyl-CoAs. The end products are 4 carbon dioxides, 6 NADH, 2 FADH2, and 2 ATP. How many times must the intermediate step happen to use the products of glycolysis for one glucose molecule? It has to happen twice, again, one for each acetyl-CoA. So the intermediate step has to go around twice, and the citric acid cycle has to go around twice. So net energy carrying molecules that come out of the citric acid cycle are 6 NADH, 2 FADH2s, and 2 ATP. And remember, 4 carbon dioxides are exhaled. They don't get recycled other than we exhale them, and then the plants can use that carbon dioxide in photosynthesis again. So now we enter the final step of aerobic respiration. This is called the electron transport chain. It's also referred to as chemiosmosis or also oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative phosphorylation are a couple of reactions together. If you're to break them down, they're referred to as the electron transport chain plus this process called chemiosmosis. Again, this is going to be the final step of aerobic respiration. This occurs on the inner mitochondrial membrane of eukaryotes. In prokaryotes, it happens on the inner cell membrane, because remember, they don't have a mitochondria. So what came out of the citric acid cycle were those NADH and FADH2s. Remember, they are charged up, they are carrying electrons, and they transfer those electrons to the electron transport chain. As those electrons flow down through a series of proteins, ATP is produced via chemiosmosis. Ultimately, those electrons get passed to oxygen, and that becomes water. Okay, so we're going to focus in here on the electron transport chain, but if you were to take a look at this whole slide, this whole big picture is the oxidative phosphorylation, and it's divided up into 2 parts. The part on the left is the electron transport chain, and then the part on the right that's labeled ATP synthase, that is the chemiosmosis part. But what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the electron transport chain happening here. And this is pictured on page 176 of your books. Okay, so as these electrons get passed from these proteins to proteins inside the mitochondrial membrane, okay, eventually they're going to get passed to water, and then there are some extra protons. You'll see those hydrogen protons at the top. Those are going to enter the ATP synthase, and that's what will produce the ATP. So now what we're doing is we're moving from the electron transport chain to the chemiosmosis part, and this is pictured on page 176 of your books. As those extra hydrogen ions flow through this ATP synthase, what type of molecule is ATP synthase? It ends in ASE, so it's going to be an enzyme. Okay, remember enzymes are proteins, and we have these proteins embedded in what kind of membrane is that? It's a phospholipid bilayer, just like the plasma membrane, but this is the mitochondrial membrane. Okay, that mitochondrial membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. So as those hydrogen protons flow through this ATP synthase molecule, it attaches that phosphate to ADP and produces ATP. Here's another way of looking at it. It's kind of like a rotor type of situation. And this is pictured on page 175 of your books. And there's also a very good Bioflix animation that is loaded in Canvas that you can take a look at.
Hydrogen ions flow back across the membrane through a turbine. Much like water through a dam, the flow of hydrogen ions spins the turbine, which activates the production of ATP. These spinning turbines in your cells produce most of the ATP that is generated from the food you eat.
So here's a little bit more detail on the electron transport chain. And this is pictured on page 174 of your books. Okay, so we have those proteins and we have those electrons being passed from protein to protein. The question is any ATP being made in this step, in the electron transport chain step? Not directly. Okay, the products of this are then going to go to the ATP synthase, to the chemiosmosis part of the step, but no ATP is directly made through the electron transport chain. Okay, so let's take a deeper look at that electron transport chain. As the electrons pass through the proteins 1, 3, and 4, they power the proteins to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. Okay, you'll notice that protein 2 is in there, but the electrons don't pass directly through that protein. It's just kind of butted up against there. So what type of transport is this? This is going to be active transport because it takes energy. So each NADH donates enough energy to pump 2.5 protons. Each FADH2 donates enough energy to pump 1.5 protons. The NAD and FAD are recycled and used again in glycolysis in the citric acid cycle. Again, so everything gets recycled. Now you may say, well, how are we doing half a proton here and there? Remember that we're talking about water and we're talking about O2 and H2. So the protons don't get split up quite evenly like that. They don't get cleaved, but we're just dividing it up that way. Okay, so we've gotten through the electron transport chain. The next step is going to be chemiosmosis. And chemiosmosis is the process of making ATP using a concentration gradient of protons. And remember, protons are H+. As those protons flow through a protein, and in this case the protein is going to be ATP synthase, and this is pictured on page 175 of your books. As those proteins flow through a protein back down their concentration gradient, they power that protein to add a phosphate group to ADP, making ATP. So, is in the presence of oxygen, remember this is aerobic respiration, we have 6 molecules of oxygen plus 10 NADHs plus 2 FADH2s, and we're ultimately going to end up at the end of this process with 28 ATPs and 6 molecules of water. Look back at your overall equation for respiration. You'll notice that on the right-hand side, the byproducts of this overall process, were 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. That's what we exhale, and 6 molecules of water. This is where those 6 molecules of water are produced. Where do we get those 10 molecules of NADH? 2 came from glycolysis, 2 came from that intermediate step, and 6 came from the citric acid cycle. And we got the 2 FADH2s from the citric acid cycle. So far, let's talk again about the electron transport chain. What are the starting components? 6 molecules of oxygen, 10 molecules of NADH, and 2 molecules of FADH2. What are the end products? 28 molecules of ATP and 6 molecules of water. Each NADH powers a protein to make how many ATPs? 2.5. Each FADH2 powers a protein to make how many ATPs? 1.5. So here's just a graphic representing now not all foods that we eat start exactly at this process. You can see on the bottom are the processes of aerobic respiration, the glycolysis, the acetyl-CoA, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. You'll notice that different foods enter this process at different points along the way. So you'll see that proteins and amino acids tend to enter the citric acid cycle directly. They don't go through those first 2 processes, whereas carbohydrates and fats go through those first 2 processes. And you've got a similar graphic. I like this graphic better, but you've got a similar graphic on page 182 of your books. So here we have, again, that overall view of aerobic respiration. It results in 4 reactions, 3 of which produce ATP. So we started out with glycolysis, and that set of reactions produced 2 ATP. The products of that then entered a prep step called the pyruvate oxidation, which produced acetyl-CoA molecule. That molecule then entered the citric acid cycle, and that went through a series of reactions which resulted in 2 ATP produced. And then the products of the citric acid cycle entered a set of reactions called the oxidative phosphorylation, which was divided up into the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. But remember, chemiosmosis was the part of that produced the 28 ATP. And so overall, the net result of aerobic respiration is we end up with 32 ATP. So that wraps up aerobic respiration for us. We have a few slides on anaerobic respiration or fermentation. Remember, we talked a little bit about that already with glycolysis. We're going to delve into that a little bit more in the next PowerPoint. It's not nearly as long as this presentation. As usual, you need to spend a lot of time with this information. There's a lot of information in this. Spend a lot of time, read your book, listen to this presentation, watch the videos, and do it over and over and over. Walk away, take a break in between, and as usual, let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day. And I've included the link there if it works for you. If not, again, this animation is in the Canvas module.